Right. So in the last couple of hours, we looked at a bunch of attacks. It's kind of the fun part of the day. Now I'm going to start showing you the various tools that we use in our work and many people around in the protocol analysis world use to do machine check proofs and find attacks systematically for these protocols. So I'm going to do it in the recipe that we follow. Typically, what I would do is, if I have a new protocol that's presented to me, I'd first write what's called a symbolic model of the protocol and try to really stress test it for all kinds of attacks. And this is what I'm going to show you now. So the tool that we use is called ProVerif, but there are other tools that do similar kinds of things. Another very good tool for doing this kind of analysis is called Tamarin. So once you have kind of really stress tested it, maybe fix some bugs in your protocol, the next step is to actually do a crypto proof. And what we do is, we might have a sketch on paper, but then we use mechanized tools again to do the crypto proof and to check that each step, each game transformation typically in the crypto proof is correct. And that's what I'm going to show you after lunch. It's using a tool called CryptoVerif. But there's another tool which is very good for doing that as well. It's called EasyCrypt. So these are there'll be links on the slides for all of these things, but you can try these out. So if you're doing a crypto proof right now and you're not entirely sure you've covered all the details and you want to make sure it's correct, you might consider using something like either CryptoVerif or EasyCrypt to do that. And the last step, after we are fully confident that we have proof of a protocol, typically we always do, is we are interested in verified implementations of these protocols. So we build implementations of the protocol and then prove that the implementation itself is functionally correct, memory safe, side channel resistant, and satisfies the same cryptographic security properties that we intended for the protocol. And all of this we do in a programming language called F star. Typically, when I give courses to programming languages students and formal verification students, I do an entire course on each of these tools. So today we're going to have like the outline and the high-level overview. I'm happy to help you guys if any of you is interested in using one of these tools over the next couple of days. We can sit down and look at some of them together. But today I'm just going to give you a flavor of what it looks like when you're using a tool like ProVerif or CryptoVerif or F star. Okay? So first, ProVerif. So the line of work where symbolic analysis tools comes from may not be familiar to many of you because it's kind of parallel to certain kinds of developments in provable security, but it's kind of independent. So the problem in this area was first formulated by Needham and Schroeder in 1978 in a classic paper, where they proposed several protocols. And some of these protocols were later on inspired protocols that were used in things like Kerberos and so on. They're basically login protocols between an Alice, Bob, and a server. There are many variations of these protocols. And just while designing these protocols, they found that they were finding lots and lots of attacks in their own design, then fixing them, then finding attacks. And they basically put the statement out there saying that protocols such as those developed here are prone to extremely subtle errors that are unlikely to be detected in normal operation. And this is interesting because this is exactly the kind of problems that we should be worried about. And in crypto, as opposed to in general software, if you have a bug, it does not necessarily result in a segmentation fault or a crash. It might look completely normal to the observer, except that in fact you have no security. This is the example of the skip attack where everything is in plain text, but actually looks completely fine, right? So they say that the need for techniques to verify the correctness of such protocols is great, and we encourage those interested to consider this area. And this gauntlet that they laid down sort of initiated a line of work, which is sometimes called protocol verification, but it's a very specific form. And it's sometimes called formal methods for protocol verification. But before the formal methods were developed for this, the first reaction to this problem of how do you design protocols which don't have these logical flaws in them were so-called informal methods, which were lists of prudent practices on how do you design protocol that were compiled by people like Ross Anderson, Roger Needham, and Martin Abadi in a couple of papers. So a classic example of this for protocol design is the explicitness principle, which you can read that from the slides if you like, but essentially what it means is that if Alice is sending Bob a message M and is signing this message, then why not just sign Alice, Bob, M together in the signature so that it's clear that this is a message from Alice to Bob and this is a message. if this is the first message in a protocol, why not add a tag that says this is message 1? So why not be explicit about what it is that you are signing, what it is that you're macking, what is it that you're encrypting. Of course, there are reasons why you may not want to do that, for anonymity reasons, for privacy reasons, and so on, in certain cases. But if you're just caring about authentication in the most simple sense, then why not be as explicit as possible? It avoids subtle errors that might creep in. A different way of interpreting the explicitness principle is that don't try to optimize your security protocol prematurely, right? So many of us, when you're designing a protocol, we say, oh, that looks unnecessary, maybe I just delete it. Or, well, I want my messages to fit into a tweet or an SMS, so I really want to compress it up to a certain point. So there might be some situations where you really are forced to optimize the protocol, but maybe you shouldn't do it first. Maybe kind of take as much space as you want in the messages and as many constructions as you need to get your proof correct. And then you kind of optimize it step by step and prove it correct at every step. But at this stage in the world, in the world of formal methods, there were no formal methods. But then around 80s and then going into the 90s, more formal methods were developed. And by which I mean that people like Dolev and Yao, they developed a way of modeling cryptography symbolically, which is an approximation of how crypto is really modeled in the standard model or by cryptographers. But this approximation allows us, the symbolic approximation, allows us to simply reason about protocols using logical rules. Okay, and in 1987, there's a band logic which came up, which is a rule-based logic for reasoning about protocols. This logic is neither sound nor complete, but it was considered quite useful and it was influential in several protocol designs. But the place that this line of work came to was a bunch of automated tools that were developed in the 2000s, including the tool that you will look at called ProVerif, but also there are other tools like Avispa, Cider, and Tamarin, which are all tools that work in the so-called formal model or the symbolic model. And these are tools that will analyze the protocol for you and will try to find the kinds of attacks like they can find things like downgrade attacks or the triple handshake attacks or other kinds of attacks which are not really cryptanalytic attacks, but more like stress testing the protocol from the viewpoint of a network adversary. And these have been applied even in 2000. They were applied to TLS-1.3, to Signal, to a whole bunch of novel protocols. So they're really becoming effective ways of finding bugs. Okay. So one thing that I would warn you even before getting into this session is that there is even though many cryptographers have been involved in the birth of formal methods, there is a strong distinction between what formal tools can give you, or this line of symbolic analysis can give you, versus what crypto proofs guarantee. And they don't match up very, very well. So on the whole, if you find a symbolic attack in a protocol, you can almost immediately translate it to an attack in the standard crypto model. Because the kinds of things you will do, a standard cryptographic adversary should be able to do. This is not always the case. In fact, you can prove that there are certain attacks that a symbolic adversary can do that the probabilistic polynomial time adversary cannot do. But let's ignore that for now. But more importantly, if I tell you that there is no symbolic attack, which is called a formal proof, if I give you a proof that against the symbolic adversary there is no attack, this does not imply a crypto proof, okay? Because the models are different. Okay? There are certain sub-cases of protocols and sub-cases of analyses for which we have these things called computational soundness theorems, which say that if I can do a proof using something like ProVerif, this actually implies a crypto proof. But that's actually a rarity. You don't really get that for most of your analyses. However, the good thing that I'm going to show you about the tools that we're going to use here, called ProVerif, is that these kinds of methods are very easy to automate, much more than crypto proofs are. And so they are great for finding attacks. So the way I used symbolic analysis tools, and the way I recommend people use it, is that this is the first thing that you try. You try to analyze a protocol using symbolic tools, find attacks. Once you fix them all, then you move on to doing the real crypto proof using a different tool. All right, so why is this not showing me full screen stuff? Okay. Okay. I hope it doesn't switch very quickly. But okay, there's some reading material in the slides, forget about that. So first thing, let's kind of clarify for ourselves what the symbolic attacker is. What is the symbolic thing that I keep talking about? So when we write protocols informally, we're going to, in our notation, use Alice and Bob, Eve, Mallory, and opponent for the attacker. Messages will be written like this. A goes to B, a message. And this is our informal notation for messaging. The symbolic threat model is essentially that the network is the attacker, which means that the attacker can intercept messages. We say A, or the opponent O, pretending to be B, can suck up a message meant for B. He can inject messages. So the opponent O, pretending to be A, can inject a message for B. And might be able to compromise one of the protocol roles. So the O is pretending to be B in this, or O is a valid instantiation of the protocol. In this case, is one of the participants in the protocol. And this is enough to do almost all of the symbolic attacks I'm talking about, including downgrade attacks. If you think about it, in the downgrade attack, what happened? The man in the middle took the message, deleted some part, sent it over, looked it back, deleted another part, and so on. Okay. So this is exactly the kind of message transformation attacks that we're talking about. We also, of course, want that the adversary to be able to do some kinds of crypto, but in a very kind of simple way. Okay, so when we write, so the main difference between the symbolic model and the standard cryptographic model is in the way we model crypto. So this is a complete model of encryption in ProVerif. Not really, but let's say. So when you want to encrypt something, we write it as a function enc, which takes a message m and a key k. We sometimes note the notation on the right with the curly brackets just to avoid having too many letters on the screen. And we want to decrypt something we call decryption with a message m with a key k. Okay. M sub k, you're right. Yeah. So the only thing we know about decryption is that decryption basically inverts encryption. Decryption of encryption with the same key will give you back m. Okay, so that's the only property we have about decryption. The other property, and this is the whole symbolic model. The attacker cannot do anything else in the world except encrypt things and decrypt things, and decryption only has that rule. Okay, so the security property this kind of models is kind of plain text confidentiality and integrity. But importantly, encryption is a perfect black box. Okay, there is no probability of inversion here. We just say it's a possibilistic model. We say that there is no probability. There is no way the attacker can get back the message without knowing that key. Okay, we can have slightly weaker models here, even in the symbolic model. I can give you more equations that model things like malleability and so on. But let's just stay with this for now. If you want to do asymmetric encryption, it's quite similar. I have a notion of private keys and public keys for each principal, and I can assume some kind of public key infrastructure. I write asymmetric encryption like this, which is p-enc of m with a public key of a, and asymmetric decryption like this, and I can define an equation like this. So this is the classic functional correctness equation for encryption and decryption. But in fact, that's all I have. I don't have any other assumption here, because for me, encryption, public encryption and symmetric encryption in this model are perfect. There's nothing else to say about this indistinguishability. The attacker gets no information out of encryption without actually doing decryption. Again, we can weaken this definitions a little bit, and we'll see that maybe after lunch. But for the most part, this is how you model thing. And similarly, you can write signatures. Signatures use a symmetric key like that, and you have a verify function that takes a message, the signature and the public key, and has this equation attached to it. If you provide it with the signature generated with the right key, it'll give you the right answer. Otherwise, nothing. No other guarantees. No other way of extracting anything from the signature. In particular, signatures here and also hash functions, as we'll see later, are treated as perfect one-way functions. There is no way of inverting them. There's no probability of inverting them at all. Okay, so there's no probabilities in this model at all. We're only talking about we're treating them as if they are perfect functions. So that equation essentially, captures within it the fact that if and only if, that's an equation. That's the only, we can check for the negation of that. So, for example, if you wanted to add some randomization to an encryption function, you can add an extra argument, which is your coins that you're adding in. And you can say that if you repeat the same nonce for 2 different signatures, in the private key is leaked to the adversary. You can write equations that actually model exactly that. But it's not like you won't be saying that the probability of the key leaking is more than half. You will just say the key is given to the adversary. So everything is either secret or not secret, and all the equations are written in a very deterministic way, even if they might have arguments that are randomly generated. So then once we are able to use cryptography like that, we want to prove security goals of this form. So typically we want to ask for confidentiality, and in this model, typically the confidentiality goal is stated in terms of what we call syntactic secrecy, which means that if there is a secret K, I want to ask if the attacker can completely obtain K. I don't talk about the number of bits of K or what's the probability of learning K or distinguishing between K and K prime. I usually say that the attacker should not be able to obtain K. Again, there are stronger notions of confidentiality which you can also model in the symbolic world, but this is the most common one. There's integrity properties that can tamper a message is going between A and B and get it to be accepted. And authentication properties like can O pretend to be A even if it's not A towards B. So these are like the classic properties that you want to prove about key exchanges, about other kinds of protocols and so on. And you can also model kind of fancier properties like anonymity and non-repudiation, and all of them are modeled in this possibilistic sense over here. There's no probabilities, it's all in terms of equations. I'm not going to really consider those in the slides to come. We're just going to try to prove things in the most simple way about confidentiality and integrity of protocols. So let's start with an exercise on seeing what the symbolic adversary can do, just given those powers that we have talked about and the kinds of attacks that we want to find by automatically from a tool. So here's a simple protocol we're going to design. It's a RPC protocol. Alice is going to send to Bob a request. Bob is going to send to Alice a response. So the most brain-dead protocol you can imagine. We want the confidentiality of both the request and response. We want the integrity, and we want the authentication of A and B. Okay? So here's one design. Obviously, it's broken, but let's say it's design, which is from A to B. A is going to encrypt the message to B using the public key, the request to B using the public key of B, and then it's going to sign the ciphertext. And B is going to send to A the response encrypted for A and signed outside by B. Okay? So this is kind of the most naive way of using public key encryption and signatures to provide confidentiality and authentication and integrity for a message. In reality, of course, you never really encrypt the request with a public key of B. You encrypt it with a symmetric key, and you encrypt the symmetric key with the public key of B, which is hybrid encryption. Let's ignore that for now. Let's just say we can directly encrypt with the public key of B. And if you think that this is kind of a completely ridiculous protocol, in fact, this is exactly what was implemented in SOAP web services with XML signatures and XML encryption for accessing web services as recently as 5 years ago. So this is a classic XML RPC protocol written in this style. Okay, so this is actually used out there. And today, if you're using JSON web services with JSON object signing and encryption, you're most likely doing something very similar. Okay? Maybe not exactly the same. Maybe it's a bit more hybrid than what I've shown you, but it's similar in spirit. So we can ask questions. You want to ask questions like, does this protocol ensure message integrity, sender authentication? Well, it's signed by the senders, and both messages are signed by the senders, and that should give us both the properties that we are desiring, and it actually does. Okay. However, of course, you can ask other questions, right? Are there replay attacks here? Right? You might want to say, yes, of course. The first message has nothing in it, which is fresh, and so an attacker who obtains the first message can keep replaying it to B, and if the message contains some state-changing request, such as deliver $1,000 to B, then you basically are replaying the attack over and over again. So this is one kind of attack that we would certainly want to be able to catch in this protocol and prevent by adding maybe some non-spaced challenge response scheme. Again, exercise: can you fix this protocol to prevent replays? But let's look at a slightly more interesting question. So suppose we are going back to my HSBC example, that the request is actually my account number, and password. And the response is actually my bank statement. Okay? So suppose this is the protocol that we're trying to protect. Somebody comes to you saying, we have a bank web app. Here's a protocol. You want to make a request and response. I want it to be asynchronous. I don't want to use TLS. Please design a protocol and verify it. So in this case, I certainly don't want my bank statement to be readable by somebody else, right? Which is why I'm providing my username and password. Does this protocol protect the confidentiality of the response? So you can stare at it for a bit. Since it's so simple, you might suspect that actually it's not enough to guarantee this property, and you would be right. Because in fact, there is a man-in-the-middle attack, which will allows the attacker to get the response. And it basically works like this. O is going to intercept the first message from A to B. And what it's going to do is replace the signature of A with its own signature. So just replaces, pulls out the signature from the outer signature and replaces it with its own signature on the encrypted data. O cannot read the encrypted data. It was encrypted for B. So it cannot actually extract the plain text, but it can change the signature on the outside. Now B thinks that the request came from O, and so it responds back to O. So it's going to encrypt the response back to O rather than to A. So with no other protections, this protocol is going to leak the response, which is my bank statement. It's going to allow the attacker to obtain my bank statement, right? So this kind of attack actually occurs over and over again in protocols based on JSON, based on XML, and so on, because of the lack of linking or strong composition between the different cryptographic mechanisms over here. So I'll leave it as an exercise for you how to fix this protocol. But typically, if you are very explicit in every part of the message about who's sending the message to who, this kind of attack would not occur, okay? Because you will not be able to replace someone's signature with your own signature. Yep. 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 So think about it like a web browser, right? So the outer signature is by the browser. It's sort of, for the server's viewpoint, it's anonymous, let's say. It's anybody could be making a connection. So I could be using any browser, and inside that, I type my username and password. So my identity, my authentication is actually inside the request. The outer and the inner identities may not be correlated. I might be allowed to use different browsers to connect. So it's going to send it back to whichever browser sent it the request, right? But if they're not, in fact, connected in a strong way, that'd be a problem. So if you fix this protocol by somehow linking or putting the O's identity into the request, I would say that's not the right fix, because in fact, depending on the scenario, I may not want to know what the browser's identity is. I mean, I don't care. What you should do is sort of use the information inside the request and the server's identity. Because the server's identity, indeed, I do want to know that I'm sending this to HSBC. And if you use the server's identity in the protocol, actually the attack will disappear. But the thing I wanted to show you here was this is, again, what I would call a symbolic attack, right? I'm not really using any deep features of the signature or the encryption. I'm just using the signature as a kind of a simple function, which I'm allowed to do, and I'm allowed to use as long as I have the symmetric key. If I have the symmetric key, I can sign. If I see a signature there, I can just delete it. If I can see the ciphertext there, I can sign it, okay? These are very simple logical operations that I can do to mount this kind of attack. And this is exactly the kind of attacks that we want to be able to find using a symbolic analysis tool. And a surprising number of problems and protocols are of this form, not deeper cryptographic problems. So there are two kinds of symbolic attacks that we looked at, and many others actually. You can do many variations on the secure RPC which are broken. And both of them are symbolic attacks that exploit logical flaws. And how can we be sure that we found them all? Okay, so this is the Needham-Schroeder problem. They propose some protocols, then they discuss between each other, and they found a bug, then they fixed it, then they found a bug, then they fixed it, and they did it a few times until they couldn't find a bug anymore. And they were worried, saying, we found 5 bugs in this, how do we know that there is not a bug in the last version? And in fact, their problem was prescient, because in 17 years after they wrote that paper, Gavin Lowe found a bug in one of the protocols that they used. and he published that as well. And he found a protocol using a tool similar to the one, or method similar to the one that we are discussing here. So what you would like to do is to formally prove that a protocol does not have any symbolic attacks. So the attacks of the form that I showed you. Okay? Before we can start doing this crypto proof, we at least want to show that. And to precisely state and prove this kind of a logical, no logical flaws theorem, we first need to kind of formalize what we mean by the protocol itself. Because when you write A sends to B a message M, it's too imprecise. We don't know what processing A is supposed to do, what processing B is supposed to do. We have to really nail it down at the level that we would nail down, say, oracles in a crypto proof. So that's my motivation for why you should pay attention to the syntax of ProVerif, which is going to look ugly and weird to you, but it's necessary if you want to do some proofs. So ProVerif is a version of the applied pi calculus, which was designed by Abadi and Fournay in 2000. And the idea, the syntax is as follows. We have a notion called names. Names are written A, B, and C. And names are used to represent keys, nonces, channels, anything that is fresh in the protocol. Okay? The processes in the protocol, the participants in the protocol, are going to send messages. And the messages are constructed in this way. You can use variables, you can use names, and you can apply functions. And the functions are treated as constructors. So it's sort of like, think of it as a way of creating a tuple of things from its components. Then the processes themselves, each process represents one participant in the protocol, typically. And so the protocol is represented as a series of processes running in parallel. So each process, well, there's a null process, which does nothing. There is a process new A.P. What it's saying is, please generate a fresh name A and use it in P. Okay? This fresh name A might be used as a nonce, maybe used as a key. It could even be used as a channel. But let's say for our purposes, mostly we'll be using nonces, session identifiers, keys. So they may be secret, they may not be secret, but they will be generated afresh. Then there is incx.p, which means input on the channel C, a message X, and then continue with the process P. Output on the channel C, a message M. Then there is a construct which allows us to call destructors. So what this says is apply the destructor G to the set series of messages M1 to Mn. And this destructor will result in some, give me a result X. And then I will, if it succeeded, I will do P. If it did not succeed, I will do Q. So one way of thinking about it is that this could be sign. So for constructors are things like signatures, encryption, and so on. This could be sign. And this could be verify. So you're saying verify a signature. If the signature verification succeeded, then I will do P. If it did not succeed, I will do Q. Similarly, you can compare things, if then else. You can put things in parallel. And this is one thing we'll use very much, which is multiple processes in parallel. And you can replicate processes. So you can say, I want to have n copies of the process P. And this is how you do multi-session kind of property. So you want to say, I want multi-session secrecy between Alice and Bob. It's not just one session. So Alice is allowed to make n copies of itself, and Bob is allowed to make n copies of itself. And then they are allowed to talk to each other. And you want each of the sessions between them to be secure. So this is the full syntax that we will use for this process calculus. The syntax of ProVerif actually has a few more things in it, but not so important for right now. So the operations that we are doing, the core operations are constructors and destructors. Constructors are written like this. They are used to build terms, and destructors are written like this, which are used to destruct terms, okay, which are allowed to open up terms that we have constructed. And a classic example is that encryption is a constructor, whereas decryption is a destructor. And so decryption comes with these rules that decryption of encryption applied to X and Y, given Y will return X. Typically, Y is a key, X is a message, but we don't care. It's a completely symbolic model. Give me any X and Y, and if you have an enc of XY and then you apply dec to it, you will get back X, as long as the Y's match up. Okay. Another function, which is a classic example, is a hash function. A hash function is a constructor. A constructor is by default a perfect one-way function. There's no collisions whatsoever. It's always perfect one-way function. And there is no destructor for hashes. So there's no way you can get back from a hash to its argument. There's nothing else you can do about hashes except compare them. That's all you can do. Okay, and for most data structures in the protocol, we will use tuples. So you'll use a tuple as just a sequence of messages that you can put together. Okay, so here's an example. So this is the Denning-Sacco protocol, which is, I think, 20 years old at least. The first message of the protocol, the goal of the protocol is to establish a secret S between A and B. The first message of the protocol, A generates a fresh key K, encrypts it, signs it with its own private key, and then encrypts it for B's public key. And the second message of the protocol, B generates a fresh session key or session secret S and encrypts it symmetrically with K and sends it back. So this protocol actually uses signatures, public key encryption, and symmetric key encryption to do this login-like protocol. So the idea is that A has to be authenticated at B because it's signed. And once it's authenticated, B gives it a session secret, like a cookie that it can use from this point on. So the model in ProVerif looks like this. The first kind of 4 lines of the protocol are the setup. So this describes our scenario. Okay, these are not the protocol yet. This is just a scenario in which we want to operate. And then there are 2 processes, one for Alice and one for Bob. And there are replicated processes, which means we can have any number of copies of A and any number of copies of B. Okay. In the setup phase, what we do is we generate 2 fresh symmetric keys, new SKA, new SKB. We compute the public keys of these symmetric keys by calling the PK function to extract the public keys. We output the public keys on a public channel C so that the adversary gets access to the public keys of A and the public key of B. We don't want to hide them. We just give them to the adversary. And then we start the protocol. And the protocol is basically any number of copies of A and any number of copies of B. What A does here is that A is willing to talk to any B. So A up there is willing to talk to any B. Now, you might decide that maybe A should only talk to B, but not to other servers. But let's be a bit more general here. So A waits for a message from the adversary. The first thing it does is it waits for a message from the adversary on the channel C. And the adversary says, please send a message to X_PKB. That's the public key of the receiver to whom I want you to send the first message. So then A generates a fresh key K. It encrypts, it signs the fresh key K with the symmetric key, with the private key of A, encrypts the whole thing with the public key that it was given by the adversary, and sends it out on the network. Then it waits for the second message. When it receives the second message, it decrypts it with the symmetric key it used in the first message, and now it has the session secret S, and then it stops. Well, we could continue on and use the session secret S in some way, but for now we just stop. What Bob does is it waits for the first message, which is the message up there. It decrypts the message, then it checks the signature, or you can verify the signature, let's say. And if the signature works out, is correct, then it encrypts, it generates a fresh S and it sends it back, or it might just use a static S and send it back. But you have many choices you can make here, but it's basically an encoding of the protocol up there. And you might want to ask here, is S secret? Is K secret? By which I mean that can K be known to anybody but A and B? Can S be known to anybody but A and B? And so on. Of course, you can have many other protocols of this kind, and coding them up in the similar syntax is left as an exercise. So what does that process that I showed you actually mean? Okay, so I showed you a process which has a setup phase, a number of copies of A, a number of copies of B. Okay. Now, ProVerif and the applied pi calculus has a semantics which tells you how this protocol is supposed to execute. Okay. And the execution is based on a non-deterministic relation called the reduction relation, which means that at any point there could be multiple things that are possible that can potentially happen, and we allow any one of them to happen. So it's like got an interleaving semantics, it's a non-deterministic semantics. And technically this is one of the places where the proofs in this model become very different from the proof in the classic cryptographic model, because we are using non-determinism here everywhere, so the adversary is technically more powerful in a certain sense, but less powerful in other senses. So they become incompatible. But anyway, so let's just look at how this thing is executed. So at runtime, what we have is a configuration of a ProVerif process, which consists of a set of names, which you think of as all the secrets that have been generated so far. All the names that have been generated so far, you put them in a set called epsilon, and then, or E. And then there's a multi-set of processes, which are all the active processes that are running in parallel at the same time. Okay? So at any point, there is a bunch of names which have been generated and a number of processes which are running. And we are allowed to pick any of the action which any of the processes can do and run them. So there's a relation called a reduction relation that is defined, which takes one configuration to the next configuration and so on. And this, the way of formalizing this is actually very standard in programming languages. It may not be familiar to everybody here, but it's a very standard way of designing a programming language. You say, here's a mini programming language, here is its syntax, here is its operational semantics. So we're defining the operational semantics for ProVerif programs. So these are all the rules for ProVerif. All of them fit in one slide. So the first one basically says that if you have a stuck process, which is 0, then you can just delete it. The second one says if you have a replicated process, which is replication of P, exclamation mark P, which is a replicated process, you can separate it out into 2 copies, one which is P, and the other which is the replication of P. So a replicated process can make any number of copies of itself. If you have a P parallel Q, which is 2 processes in parallel, you can break them apart and put them into the multi-set so they can both run at the same time. If you have a fresh name generation like new A, if the protocol is generating a fresh nonce, you take the nonce that is being generated and you put it into the set of names on the protocol, and then you continue on in E. And similarly, when you have 2 processes, one of which is willing to do an output on the channel, one of which is willing to do an input on the channel, you can match the output and the input and take the output from here and transfer it to the input over there. This is the main communication operation that you can do. Similarly, if you have a destructor application, and if the thing that you're applying it to actually matches the destructor rule, then you're allowed to simplify it. And if it does not match the destructor rule, you go in the else case. And that's it. So these are all the rules by which configuration in ProVerif can evolve over time. Okay? So let's take an example. So let's take the Denning-Sacco protocol model that we had before, which is this stuff. Okay? No, is this stuff? Oh, this stuff, okay. From here to here. And let's put it in parallel with an adversary. The adversary is going to be very benign. And all the adversary is going to do is he's going to wait until the Denning-Sacco model gives him the public key of A and the public key of B. And then he's going to trigger the process A and say, please communicate with B. Okay? So I'm calling it the adversary because it is actually the one which is triggering the protocol, but it's actually a very simple and benign adversary. It's not doing anything bad. It's just saying, please start the Denning-Sacco protocol from A to B. And that's what this process is doing up here. It's taking the PK of A, the PK of B, and it's outputting on the channel C, saying, A, please start the process of B. So in the initial configuration of this, there's one public channel, C, which is in the set E, and there is this one big fat process down there, which we have to execute. So the first thing we do is that we have a parallel composition between the adversary and the protocol, and we can decompose the parallel composition to make them into 2 different processes, the attacker process and the regular process. So we just flatten it out. Then the adversary is the process on top there, over here. It's really doing nothing. It's just saying, I'm going to wait for you to generate keys. You give me the public key of A, the public key of B, and then I'm going to trigger A. By the last message, the output is going to trigger A to start the protocol with B.
So you're specifying what the adversary is doing. You're not saying for every adversary.
So in this one, I'm just showing you an example of how the protocol executes with one very specific adversary. But eventually, we want to prove that this protocol is secure with respect to all adversary, right? But but first I'm describing just to show how the calculus works and how the algebraic steps are going to work in this process calculus, how it executes. And later on, you want to show that no matter what the adversary is, you still have the right security property. So with this adversary, the protocol just should execute perfectly. Like A should send a message to B, B should send a message to A. Everything should work perfectly fine. We expect nothing bad will happen. Okay, and that is. We just want to see that the protocol actually executes as expected. That's why I'm calling it a benign adversary. All right, so the first step we're going to do is generate SKA and SKB. This is the first thing that can happen, because this guy is waiting for a message, and there's nobody who's willing to send it a message right now. There's only 2 processes, and there's an input there, so he's waiting. But this guy can do something. He can generate the SKA and SKB. So let's generate the SKA and SKB and put it into the set of names on top, up there, saying that, okay, now I have 3 names in this world. I have C, there's SKA and SKB. Okay, now I have to compute the public keys corresponding to SKA and SKB. And I can do that, and I can inline them into the rest of the code. So now I have, this guy is going to output on the channel C the public key of SKA, and then output on the channel C the public key of SKB. But now these two match up. So I can actually communicate, do a communication step between the two of them. In fact, let me do both communications at the same time. So then once I complete both communications, the attacker adversary process is now going to do an output here. There's nobody who's waiting for an input though. So he cannot actually do this output right now. But down there we have a parallel composition. We can decompose it into 2 copies. So we can flatten it. And then there is a replication. And every time I have a replication, which is an exclamation mark, I can make 2 copies of the process. Okay? So let me make 2 copies of A. One which actually is just the raw A, and one is back to the replicated copy. So the replicated copy like forks one process up here. So now I have this input and this output, and they match up, and I can actually do the communication across them. So let's do that communication. So now A has started. So now the protocol has finally started. So far we were just running the setup phase of the scenario and blah, 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 and now the protocol has started. Okay? So now the process A is going to generate a K and send out the first message. First it generates a K. K goes into the top list of names. We just call it K prime just for clarity, because every time we generate a fresh K, it's going to be a new K. So the next time it's going to be K2, K3, K4, and so on. Now I'm going to send out this output message, but B is not ready because B is not in a position where it can receive that message. I have to unroll B and fork out a copy of B2. So I'm going to do that, and then B will receive the message. So there is, now A has sent out the message, now B is over here. It's trying to decrypt the message first, and now that we have communicated, we know that the thing it's trying to decrypt was actually an encryption with the right key, blah, blah, blah. So the decryption rule will apply there, and the decryption will succeed. And once the decryption succeeds, we'll try to check the signature, and the signature will succeed too, because the signature is also with the right key. So since both of them will succeed, we will then go to the last message, where B is trying to send on the channel C the encryption of S with K prime, and A is willing to receive that message. They both will communicate with that. The decryption on A's side will succeed, and everything is done. Okay? So this is the full execution of the protocol in the most simple scenario where nothing bad has happened. The attackers are not doing anything bad. A and B are communicating with each other exactly as expected. Okay? Now, if in the beginning I had put a different attacker in the place of that attacker who was actually trying to steal the secrets, then that would be a different shape of the attacker process, and the trace that you would have run would have been different. Okay? And the trace that we would have run, the execution we would have run, might have leaked the secret to the attacker as well. And we'll see. I'll show you how that works. Yep.
Is there a fixed order in which these basic rules are applied?
No. So at any point there might be multiple rules that apply, and you non-deterministically pick one of them, not randomly, but non-deterministically pick one of them. So which is what I was mentioning, that so the kind of non-determinism here is trying to mimic random choice and so on, but it actually has a completely different expressive power. So if you introduce non-determinism into any classic crypto model, the attacker can obviously non-deterministically guess a key in 128-bit key in 128 steps, right? So you don't want to introduce non-determinism in a computational model. But here, this is okay because our encryption is perfect, and our keys are unguessable. Okay, so
basically try all possibilities?
yeah, it'll try. Yeah, so what we want to do is, given a semantics like this, we want to say, okay, let's start from this. So we want to say, I'm not going to give you the adversary. This is arbitrary underscore. Okay, I'm going to give you this process. I'm going to give you an initial state. I want you to try all possible traces with all possible adversaries, find all executions, and see, is there any possible state that you can reach where a secret that I wanted to be kept secret actually has been given to the adversary. Okay, so it's like a complete exploration. Well, something here might be broken. So, so for example, if I try to prove that, let's say, the K there is secret, well, it's actually trivially not secret because the attacker gives me the public key here. So if the attacker gives me his own public key, I'm going to encrypt K for the attacker's public key, and K is going to leak immediately. Okay. So, so let's ask a more pertinent question. If the S was only supposed to be between B and A, then is S secret? And in fact, that's also not secret because there is a similar sort of logical attack that you can apply where you send it to the attacker then re-encrypts it for the right guy, and because the signature in this protocol does not cover enough things, where is the signature? The signature only covers K. It doesn't say who this message is for. In fact, signatures generated by A can be redirected or replayed or forwarded by the recipient to some other person, and he won't be able to tell the difference. This protocol allows S to be leaked. So the protocol, the Denning-Sacco protocol actually is broken. Okay, so and we can find that just by applying the symbolic analysis. And I'll show you it in a second how the tool kind of figures it out. Okay. So when we are trying to analyze this protocol, we want to analyze it for all possible adversaries. So what is the adversary? The protocol is always executed in parallel with an adversary. So it's also a regular process in the same language, but the process can be any process in the language which is allowed to communicate with the protocol over the public channel C. Okay. It is also given some number of names, so it can generate its own keys if it wants. It can send whatever messages it wants, and any message that comes on the public channel, it's allowed to read, and it's allowed to send any message on the public channel, right? And it's the whole system that we are talking about is like is a closed process. So the adversary and our protocol together form a closed process, so that we can then run the protocol and ask questions about these closed processes. And the symbolic secrecy goal that we will try to prove is a very simple goal. It's not about indistinguishability or anything. It is just that the adversary should never be able to obtain the entire secret term that we are trying to protect, which means that secret M should never be output on a public channel. Okay? So it's not even information flow. It's just like the whole secret should never be output on the public channel. The way you normally test this is by providing the adversary with a guessing oracle. You give him a process where he can guess what the secret is, which you're trying to protect. And if he manages to exactly hit the secret, if the secret that you're trying to protect is equal to the secret, the guess that he provided, then you say, then you raise an event called fail, which means the attacker wins. Okay? So, and we're going to try to prove that this kind of event can never happen. In no trace of the protocol should we be able to reach a place where the attacker has been managed to guess a secret that we were trying to protect. And there are formal ways of defining this in terms of the semantics that I showed you and so on. The details are probably not important for you guys. So how does ProVerif analyze this kind of protocol? Well, the way it does it is that given a process which represents the protocol, it is going to try to compute the set of all the terms that the attacker can obtain in all the runs. So it's going to try to compute a sort of a conservative approximation of all the terms that the attacker can learn. This set is obviously infinite. Okay, so because if the attacker learns the term X and the attacker learns the term Y, then the attacker can compute the term encryption of X and Y. It can also compute the term encryption of X, Y with Y, and encryption of encryption of encryption. So it can create an infinite set of terms. Okay, so the attacker can generate messages of unbounded size. And the number of sessions of the protocol, because we are not limiting the number of times you can fork off a replicated process into individual processes, is also unbounded. So the set of terms that we have to consider that the attacker might know over the lifetime of the protocol across all sessions is actually unbounded. Okay? So because of which, the general problem of even in that simplified symbolic model of proving of asking the question of whether or not the attacker can obtain a secret in the protocol or not, in general, is undecidable. Okay? There are various ways in which they can be bounded. So if you bound the size of messages that can be sent in the message by the attacker or by you or by the principals and the number of sessions, then you get into a finite state model, and obviously it's all nice and decidable. In fact, even if you bound the number of sessions, the number of times you can replicate a process, but leave the number of messages to be unbounded, it's still, there's a nice proof that this is the verification problem becomes decidable even though it's NP complete. Okay? And a lot of tools use either bounded messages or bounded sessions in order to bound the protocol analysis problem so that they can actually algorithmically solve it. If you use unbounded messages, unbounded number of sessions, the problem has been shown to be undecidable. And so then you have to deal with this undecidability in some way, in the most general case. There are several ways people have tried to do this. One is you can use user help, right? You can use human help to guide the proof, because an algorithm cannot for sure say yes or no, but you can use human help. And that's what interactive theorem proving tools like Coq and Isabelle and so on do when they are doing security proofs. Or you can use approximations. There are various kinds of approximations you can use to make a conservative analysis, which means that if you find an attack after the approximation, it's still an attack. But if you find a proof after the approximation, it's still a proof. But if you find an attack, it might be a false attack. Okay? So you have false positives, but you don't have false negatives. So ProVerif, the tool that we will look at, actually uses approximations, but also allows non-termination. What it means is that for the most part, when you analyze the protocol with ProVerif, it will say, yes, there is no attack, or no, there is an attack, and here it is. But it might also just not terminate. It might say, I don't know. I don't know whether this is secure or insecure. Now, the engineering of the tool that Blanchet has done is such that, for the most part, it will be in the first two cases, and very rarely will it fall into the third case. But we cannot really fully get rid of the non-termination because of this undecidability problem. Other tools like Tamarin use user interaction, so that in the cases when it says, I don't know, the user can provide certain hints to guide the prover to finding a proof, a positive proof or a negative proof. So the tool that we are using is ProVerif. It is fully automatic, which means you can put in a model like the Denning-Sacco model I showed you. You can press the button, and you can ask whether it's secure or not, and I'll show you a demo in a second. And it works on unbounded number of sessions, unbounded message size. And you can code various kinds of crypto primitives in it. I showed you like encryption and decryption, but it's actually programmable. So you can write any of your favorite people have written zero-knowledge constructions as equations in ProVerif and try to analyze protocols that rely on that as well. It does not always terminate, it's not complete, but it's quite efficient and it's very precise. So very often, if there is an attack, it'll actually give you a trace of the attack. So let me show you how this works. So this, sorry, I had a big font, but it went away. That looks big enough, I guess. Is it big enough for the people at the back, or should it be bigger? Bigger? Really big? That's good? Okay. All right, let's try with this. So this is the Denning-Sacco protocol that we are trying to code up here. So this is ProVerif syntax. We've defined the channel, public channel here, C, saying it's a global public channel. Everybody can read and write on it. There are some types that we will use, like hosts and nonces and keys and public keys and so on. This is the equations that define public key encryption. There's P encrypt and P decrypt, and I can define whatever I want, but here's my model of decryption. I think the line breaks are strange because of the font size, but this is the model of public key encryption. This is all I tell you. Then there is a model of signatures down here, which is talking about sign and verify. And once you have a signature of a message, I'm also allowing you to extract the, let me put it up. So you can sign a bit string with a private key, which is called an S key. You can verify the signature, and it will succeed only if you are trying to verify, in fact, something that was signed with Y, as long as you're giving with the public key of Y. So Y is the private key and PK of Y, the public key here. I also added a second equation that says if you know the signature of X with some secret key Y, I will allow you to extract the plain text, the message from it, which is the X, not the Y. I don't give you the secret, I don't give you the private key, but I will allow you to extract the message from the signature. This just allows us to be more compact when we are sending messages. And here's your symmetric encryption.
Can you model things like where you have numerous signatures for a specific message and you can model a signature, or it doesn't just, you can't model that at all?
Sorry, what kind of?
Like you have a signature, I have a valid signature and a valid message, and the computer can change the signature to be a different signature on the same valid message.
Right.
That
So.
thing can be modeled, you think?
So the signature value itself would be
Then I would
different.
be able to, I would actually accept, I would verify something which wasn't actually signed, but is still a valid signature, it's a valid message.
Right. So what I can say is, suppose my signature were to include some random value, okay, like a nonce. So let's say the signature actually takes a nonce as well, okay, and gives me back a tag, which is here, which is actually whatever it is. Now when I'm trying to give this bit string, X is a bit string and Y is a private key. Now, I don't care what the nonce is as long as the signature is valid. No, sorry. As long as the signature is valid, I'm willing to say OK. And I might allow you to have a function, well, let me call it swap, that takes n xy and a second value which is n prime. It takes two nonces. N is a nonce, n prime is a nonce, x and y, and it gives me back a signature of n prime xy. So I can write something like this. I can't, I mean, this is, so since signature is a constructor, unless I provided different arguments, it's not going to be different. You know, if a sign of xy is just the same value. But I can provide it two different arguments, and I can say, oh, if you know the signature of xy with a nonce, I'm willing to allow you to malleate it into a signature, which has a signature with n prime. And it has, it's a different value, let's say, but it'll also verify, because the rule above there ignores n. So this is the way I would model this. Okay, now this is going to mess with me, because I just changed my demo code in the middle. All right, so hopefully it works. Okay. All right, let's remove swap. Assign xy, assign xy. Looks fine so far. Okay, we'll find out. I can remove the nonce again, I guess. Looks kind of okay. Okay, so this is encryption, symmetric encryption, S-encrypt and S-decrypt. Now, one thing that you will notice is that this model of encryption, since symmetric encryption is a perfect function, it's a constructor, this is implicitly authenticated encryption, okay? So I'm not allowing you, I mean, if you decrypt something, you know that it was encrypted with that key. So there is no chosen ciphertext attack here. We are assuming that this is AEAD. You can weaken, again, by adding some equations, allow the attacker to do some things and make this closer to an int CPA kind of model. But here you think of this, when I say symmetric encryption, I really mean AEAD, or authenticated encryption. Not AEAD, just AE. Okay, so now we want to write some security goals. So I can say, okay, I have a secret bit string here. And this bit string is a secret, which is what is written as private. And a secret that should only be known to A and B. So B knows this to begin with, and it will only give it to A. Okay? So this is not supposed to be for everybody, so for A and B. And so B is going to give this to A. And I want to ask the question, is the secret, can the attacker learn the secret? That's my main query I want to ask. Okay? I can also add some events in the protocol which will allow me to prove some other authentication goals, but let's ignore that for now. So the process for A is looking like this. So this is exactly what we wrote before, but it's an actual ProVerif syntax. So the process A starts with knowing its own private key. That's what it needs to know to start up. It's going to receive this XPKB from the attacker. It's going to generate a fresh key. It's going to convert the key into a bit string by calling the K2B function. So these are the kind of things that you have to do in the model just to make sure that the formatting is right. And then it's going to sign this message with a private key of A, encrypt it for XK of B, and send it out. And then it's going to receive the second message, decrypt it, and say that I'm done. So this is like an event that says the protocol is over. Process B, the dual, like we discussed before. So there's nothing very surprising here, blah, blah, blah. And here's the top level process. There's an SK of A, SK of B. Let's ignore this stuff for now. SK of A, SK of B. I'm going to give the attacker on the public channel the public keys of A and B. I'm going to start the process A with the private key of A, and the process of B with the private key of B and the public key of A. So B is only willing to talk to A, but A is willing to talk to anybody. Okay, so that's the setup here. So the question we are asking is S secret? Okay, that's our main question we are asking. So let's do that. Okay, I think I need this to be. Oh God, I forgot how to do that. Does anybody remember? Here. No. Yes. Mac. Good. So I can run ProVerif on the Denning-Sacco protocol, and since we edited it, it could be. Okay, good. All right. So it says at the bottom, and let me push that up a little bit, that I asked it whether attacker could know the bit string S. Okay? And the result it gives me that the attacker, well, it's a double negation, so you have to parse it carefully. So it says, not attacker bit string S is false. And this kind of gives you a hint about what ProVerif is trying to prove. It's trying to prove the negation of the security goal. And if it succeeds in finding the negation of the security goal, it has a counterexample. And if it fails to prove the negation of the security goal, it is you have the proof, right? A symbolic proof. So it's trying to say here that the attacker can actually find the secret S, and here it gives you a trace. It says that this is what is going to happen. This is your trace. New SKA is generated by A, new SKB. The attacker gets both the private public keys. Then the attacker asks you to communicate with some random person A1707. Okay? For which it knows the public key, private key, right? So it's not asking A to communicate with B. This is a real attacker. It's asking A to communicate with somebody else called A1707. Now A is going to create a K. It's going to encrypt this K for 1707. And then what is going to happen is that the attacker is going to take that message, is going to take the signature which is on the inside, and is going to re-encrypt it for B. So the attacker takes a message which was sent from A to 1707, since it is 1707 to the attacker, and it re-encrypts it for B. The crucial thing is that the signature on the inside of that message, it doesn't have to modify, because the signature does not say who the signature is for. It just says, I'm signing K. So he's able to take the signature and just pass it along to B. And when B gets that message, it sends back on that key, which is K, the secret that it was trying to protect. Because B thinks it's talking to A. Because B sees the signature of A, it's got received a message which is encrypted for it, and it's going to send back the key encrypted of thinking it's sending it to A. But in fact, this secret is sent to the attacker. So earlier in the slides, you saw an attack where we had a encryption, and outside we have a signature, and the fact that the attacker can swap the signature for his own signature. This is the dual attack, where you're doing a signature, then an encryption, and the attacker can remove the outside encryption and re-encrypt it for somebody else. This is exactly the dual of that thing. These are classically known problems with encrypt and sign then encrypt that you have to be careful about how you compose them. And in both these protocols, there was a failure of composing them properly. So how shall we fix it? So one way to fix it, and the way I would recommend, is that when A is signing this message, it should sign it and should say who is it for. Okay? Now, notably, this exact attack appeared in OpenID Connect and OAuth 2.0, which are single sign-on protocols, has appeared in various implementations of the SAML single sign-on protocol, because people sign a credential and provide it to somebody. So in the single sign-on protocols, you go to Google and you say, I want a token which will allow me to log into Pinterest. And Google is supposed to give me a signed token that I can provide to Pinterest. Now, if that signed signature token only contains a signed random nonce, then exactly the same attack appears. However, in recent versions of the protocol, to fix this bug, they have included something called an audience. You say, here's a nonce, and this token is only valid for Pinterest.com. So that if you obtain this token, which is meant for Pinterest.com, you cannot use it on a different website. Okay? So although this is on a very abstract thing, this exact same attack has appeared very recently in the real world. So to fix this, I would suggest that we add the recipient's name, and of course I would suggest that because I already have that in my script. So let's see. So instead of just sending the key, let's send the key and the public key of whoever it is that we are communicating with. We don't know if this is B. We're just saying, I'm going to send this message to XPKB, whoever it is, and I'm going to sign the recipient, intended recipient, along with the key that I'm sending. And similarly, in process B, okay, let's just try this anyway. Does this fix the problem? It does, because in fact, actually that's true. I'm worried why this is working. Something bad happened. What did I do? What did I do? What did I do? Sign M. No. Okay. So B actually stopped right here. It didn't parse. So let me show you what happened exactly. Right. So in fact, it said that S is actually secret, and this is actually okay. This is worth looking at because in fact, this kind of bug happens quite often when modeling. So if I look just at this result, I would say, hey, I fixed the protocol, it's all done, okay? But now we get back to the fact of why I added those events at the bottom of the protocol. Because if you go up a little bit, and if you see here, we find that the event send B was never executed, which means B never completed the protocol, okay? So the reason S is secret in this particular run is because S was never sent on the wire. Because I made a mistake in my model, I changed half of my model, but not the other half. So what's going to happen in process B is that it receives this message, it decrypts it, which works, it verifies the signature, which works, and now it says, oh, the message content must look like this. But it's no longer the case. The message content that is coming from the other side has two components to it. It's not just a key, it's a key and a public key. So this parsing step here fails. And since this parsing step fails, B stops, doesn't continue. So it never sends S out on the network. So this is a false way of fixing the protocol because the protocol actually doesn't work anymore. Okay, it's not completing. So in fact, a large majority of ProVerif scripts that you will first write will be secure for exactly the wrong reasons, which will be that they're not doing anything. Okay, and so protocols that don't do anything are perfectly secure. So what you need to do is to always make sure, which is why we always add events like this towards the end of the protocol, to make sure that the protocol is actually proceeding all the way to the end. Okay. So here I added so we have this event called send B, which will be triggered just before it sends out the message on the network, and you always want to check whether send B is being executed, because it means that actually the protocol is completing. And here this basically says that in fact send B was never executed. Well, not is true means it was not executed. You have to learn how to read these results from ProVerif, but that's what it means. On the other hand, well, okay, that's fine. So now if I fix the parsing step and B to make sure that it parses the message correctly. Okay, let's do one more step, just for fun. So let's fix the parsing, but not actually check the public key. Let's just say that the thing that you gave me was some nonsense. I don't care. Okay? So I'm fixing the parsing, but not really doing any extra checks on who this key was meant for. So I'm not checking it. So this should not actually fix the protocol, right? Bug. Line 70, character 14. Oh, okay, fine. This was supposed to be a public key. Okay. So I find that in fact the attack still exists. Almost exactly the same attack still appears. Because even though we added something to the signature, the other guy is not checking what we added to the signature. And this is again a very common pattern. So you may add as much as you want to your messages, unless the other person checks it, you don't get any guarantees. Okay. So now let's actually check. So the important point here is that A has signed the identity of the intended recipient, and B is checking that the intended recipient is me. And only then does it release the key. So this is checking that the second part of the message is equal to my public key. So the A actually meant to send it to me, and only then will I accept this token, let's say, this login request. Now if I do that, you find that in fact, all the good things happen, the protocol completes, so the event send B is executed. It says is executed is at the right there. The event send B is executed, so the protocol ends, and still the secret S is actually secret, which means we can prove that the attacker does not obtain the attacker does not obtain the bit string S. Okay, so this is just proving secrecy of the session secret in Denning-Sacco. And we've already found like 2 or 3 little symbolic attacks which should have prevented this. We fixed the protocol when we found it. So once we get to this stage, we can now proceed with like, okay, maybe we want to add some authentication goals, and you can prove that the authentication properties hold true and so on. And once you have really exercised all the various properties that you want and made sure there's no logical flaws, that's the point at which you want to move on to the crypto proof. So let me go back to the slides for a few minutes, and then we'll stop. So in the slides, you'll see some more slides on how ProVerif actually works, which is that it compiles the notation that I showed you, which was all about processes and so on, into horn clauses, and then runs a standard, well, not a standard, but a fancy resolution algorithm, just like Prolog, to try to find all possible messages that the attacker can get. And then it sort of figures out what's the overall approximation of this and tries to prove properties on that. So the encryption, blah, 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 doesn't matter, maybe. Okay, you can go read this in the slides. I think it's not worth spending more time on this. But we can also code up authenticity using these events that I showed you, and you can look at what the authentication goals look like. And when we come back after lunch, I'll show you how the techniques that we looked at there can apply to TLS 1.3. And then we'll move on to how to do crypto proofs about processes which are written in a very similar syntax to what I showed you, like the same kind of models, but we'll do crypto proofs on them, not just symbolic analysis. All right.